I'm going to show you how to use REST and Orchestrator. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VMware. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. This is part 10 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. Here in part 10, we're going to be looking specifically at Orchestrator. In the previous video, we showed you how you could add multiple REST operations to your Orchestrator server, making use of a technology called Swagger, now known as OpenAPI 3.0.0. We're going to do the same sort of thing in this particular video, but this time, instead of calling the workflow that adds the REST operations by using a Swagger spec string, we're going to use a URL. So we have a separate workflow here to do that same thing. What we're going to do as an example, again, this was a great example of doing this via a string, but we want to do this a little differently this time. So I'm going to go search for swagger.io pet store. The fine folks at swagger.io have been kind enough to provide us an example REST server that's modeled on a pet store. So let's go see what documentation we can find on this here. So first thing you'll see is that there's an older 2.0 version of this. Again, that's for Swagger spec 2.0.0. But let's take a look at the newer OpenAPI version. So we're going to go down here to Swagger Editor. And in the Swagger Editor entry here, you can see actual Swagger definition over, or OpenAPI 3.0 over on the right. But what I want to draw your attention to, first of all, is this example REST API provides a bunch of different REST operations, which you can see listed here. Now, again, I would encourage you to go ahead and read through the documentation that they're providing here, but I'm going to shortcut things a bit here. I'm going to open up another tab, and in this tab, I'm going to this specific URL. And let's go ahead and take a look at what we find there. This is JSON formatted data, and what this data defines is various REST operations that we are going to add to our Orchestrator server. Now, looking at this here as a single no line wrapping blob of JSON is pretty hard to read. So what I'm going to do before we actually go into Orchestrator, to let you see the structure of this here, I'm going to highlight all of this. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to take it over into Notepad++. And I'll paste it into Notepad++. Again, I still can't really make heads or tails of this, so let's see if we can get this prettied up. I'm going to go to Plugins, and I'm going to use JSON Tools to make this pretty. And additionally, I'm going to use JSON Tools, perhaps even more importantly, to open up the tree viewer over here on the right side. Let me resize this here. And since I don't want to look at this just yet, I'm going to go to View, and I'm going to choose to fold up everything. We can come look over here later on if we want. But for right now, I just want to show the structure of this OpenAPI 3.0 spec. So it's in JSON format. Again, the spec allows for JSON or YAML. This example here is in JSON. In the previous video, the example was in YAML. But I'm going to expand this here. And as you can see, there are different sections, including the section here called paths is perhaps the most important of all because it defines the paths, the endpoint URLs, to all of the different operations supported by this REST API. Additionally, it's got other information. For example, the info gives information about what this API is about. Servers gives information about where we can contact servers that run this API, and so forth. But again, the key thing here is these paths. And if you take a look at any of these paths, such as the store/inventory path, if you expand, it'll tell you which HTTP methods are supported. If you expand again, it gives you a description about each of those, and it talks about what the responses are that would you expect, and so forth. So all the information that we need is actually here in this single JSON file that we're accessing through a URL. So let's go back to our web browser, and we are going to copy in this URL because we need it over here in Orchestrator. So in Orchestrator, we're going to run the Swagger spec from a URL workflow. And when we do so, once again, we need to give it a name. This time I'm going to call it basic URL to distinguish it from the basic REST server API that we added in the previous video. We need to point to the URL. Again, the documentation that I took you to, if you dig through it deep enough, you'll eventually find this is the URL. And now we get to specify whether we want to use Swagger 2.0 or Open API 3.0. Now, the rest of this here, with one exception, is the same sort of things that we've seen before. So I'm going to fill these out the way we've done before. But what we need here is a URL. So I'm going to grab this part of our URL. Again, that's pointing to where the REST server is running. Under spec authentication, we could provide a username and password if that was required by the REST server that we're communicating with. Plus, we also have an authentication tab and an SSL tab like we've seen before. But we don't need to fill out anything there. In this particular example, we just need to go to host properties, fill in all the fields, click run. And as you can see, our workflow has run successfully. Let's click close. Once again, we'll go over to the inventory. And in the inventory, if we expand, this entry here was from the previous video. What we just added was this REST server. If we looked at the previous video's REST server, you'll recall that we didn't have very many REST operations. But take a look at this new REST server and all of the different operations that we brought in by running a workflow just once. So again, as you can see, using the workflow, whether you use the one that adds by string or adds by URL, adding a multitude of operations all at once is very quick, very straightforward, provided the REST server that you're working with is using the Swagger IO technology. Now, since we've gone through the trouble of adding in all of these different operations, why don't we see if we can quickly whip up a workflow to make use of it? So let's go over to card view, and we're going to create a new workflow called, let's give it a terribly uninspired name. Let's call it test. And under test, we'll skip a lot of the details here. We'll jump straight to the schema tab. We will drag in a workflow element because what we'd like to do is to invoke a REST operation. This is just like we've done before. So we're going to invoke a REST operation. But this time, when we set the REST operation, we are going to pick one of the new REST operations that we just added in. So I'm going to select the REST server, which is this basic URL. And why don't we use that one that I showed you just a moment ago? I believe it was this one. Let's do a get inventory to see what's in the pet store. If we click select, we now have created that one piece of information, but there's a bunch of other potential information we need to pass in, including these parameters, which we're not going to do in this example. Same thing's true of the header parameters that you see down in the bottom. For content, this is the request body. I'm just going to leave it blank. I'll create a variable for it, but I'm leaving it blank. The default content type we'll say is application/JSON. Again, skipping all these header parameters, we'll go ahead and set up the accept headers to say if you're going to send something back, send it back in this format. And then down below, we get to specify how we're going to capture the output of this workflow call. So let's capture its status code. Now you know that with this status code, we're looking for a value back such as 200 or something in the 200 range. In this example, I'm not going to bother checking that, but maybe I will. We'll find out. Content length, again, This is information that's passed back. I just need to create a variable that can store that information in. So that's the length of the response body. Headers, these are going to be the response headers. I like to rename this one response headers, just so it's clear to me that these are response headers, not request headers. Then for content string, I prefer using the name response body. All right, so we've set up all our inputs, we've set up all our outputs. I don't think we're going to need this, but why don't we take 30 seconds to set up an exception handling variable. So we'll create new. I'm going to call it error code, just in case there's a problem. We've got a place to put any exception messages. And we should be able to save this. Once again, if we validate this, I'm expecting that we're going to get some warning messages because we intentionally did not set a bunch of parameters and header parameters, but that's okay. They're just warnings. They're just warnings in this case. If we run this workflow, saving the workflow and running it, we let it run. It's completed running, and if we want to, one place we could go see what happened would be to go look at the variables. Let me resize this here so that we can see a little better. And what we're interested in here is the response body. Now this response body is not particularly extensive because our pet store apparently doesn't have much in it. But as you can see, I've gotten back a response body. This response body is in JSON format, and you know from previous videos that we could use JSON.parse to pick out the individual pieces of this simple data that's been returned, or we could have received a much more complicated response body, but using the techniques that we've already learned, using techniques such as JSON.parse, we could pick apart whatever they happen to send back to us. So once again, you now know a multitude of ways that you can add REST operations to your Orchestrator server. Join me in the next video as we continue our exploration into REST and Orchestrator.